They didn't scream when they were born because they already knew silence would keep them alive. In February 1856, deep in the snow-choked hills of southern Ohio, a fugitive woman gave birth to 3 sons in the basement of a hidden Quaker meeting house during a manhunt so intense it could have ended in fire and chains. But what happened that night defied every known law of nature. The babies made no sound. Their eyes opened wide, unblinking, as bounty hunters paced just feet above their heads. Witnesses swore they seemed to know they were being hunted. Know what others couldn't say out loud. This isn't just a historical mystery. It's a supernatural origin story rooted in America's darkest past, tied to the Underground Railroad genetic mutation and the terrifying possibility that human evolution already took a turn. And no one noticed. They called her Annalise, though no one knew if that was her real name. She arrived in Cedar Mills on a frost-bitten February night, her boots soaked in blood and river water belly swollen with triplets. Locals whispered she had crossed 3 states on foot, evading bounty hunters, guided by a map etched in hymns and scars. The Quakers took her in, sheltering her beneath their meeting house, a hidden cellar lined with straw carved into the Ohio clay by abolitionist hands. But even then, something felt wrong. She didn't act like a woman in fear. She didn't tremble. She spoke little, but when she did, it was about things no one had told her. She said the hunters were coming before anyone heard hoofbeats. She called people by names they hadn't yet spoken aloud. And worst of all, she claimed her sons weren't just children. They were born for something waiting, something that already knew how to listen through woodstone and flesh. And as the storm outside turned the ground to ice, 3 silent heartbeats pulsed beneath the floor, waiting for the first knock that would begin everything. The night she arrived, the dogs wouldn't bark, and the wind refused to howl. It was February 23rd, 1856, when Annalise stumbled into Cedar Mills, Ohio, a name barely marked on any map but infamous along the Underground Railroad. For one reason, no fugitive who made it there was ever caught. That night, a blizzard had rolled in hard from the west, turning the hills into pale grave mounds and silencing every creek and fence post for miles. Annalise appeared at the doorstep of the Quaker meeting house just after midnight, soaked, trembling, and visibly pregnant. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled Elias Gray. It was her eyes, wide alert, too calm. She didn't beg. She didn't flinch when told slave catchers had passed through just hours before. Instead, she asked one thing: is the cellar still beneath the pulpit? No one had ever spoken of it aloud, not even within the Gray family. And yet she knew things she shouldn't, knew names, knew when the riders would return. Elias had harbored dozens of runaways before, but never one like this. The kind that felt hunted not just by men, but by something older, darker, and silent. And as Annalise stepped across the threshold, the candles flickered against the windless air, as if something had entered with her. Something that didn't come alone. They weren't born screaming. They were born listening. Less than 12 hours after Annalise arrived, the storm outside deepened, coating the fields in 4 feet of snow and sealing off the roads with fallen trees. It was the kind of weather that turned farms into prisons and made search parties vanish. Underground beneath the Quaker meeting house, Miriam Gray and her daughter Lydia prepared the hidden cellar for a birth unlike any they'd ever assisted. Annalise never once cried out. She breathed in controlled silence, her eyes fixed not on the midwives, but on the floorboards above, as if she could feel each snow-laden footstep that passed by. And when the babies came one by one, a silence fell so heavy it choked the air. No cries, No flailing arms, no gasping for breath. Just 3 infant boys' eyes wide open, tracking every shadow on the dirt ceiling. One reached for Miriam's trembling hand. Another blinked exactly in sync with the lantern's flicker. The third smiled. Not a reflex, not gas. A knowing smile. That's when Lydia whispered it aloud for the first time. Something's wrong. But it wasn't wrong. It was different. These weren't just newborns. They were aware, and something deep in the marrow of everyone present understood that whatever had just entered this world wasn't leaving quietly. They didn't cry, but the walls did. That night, as the Grey family huddled above the cellar in uneasy silence, strange things began to happen. The frost on the windows didn't form the usual delicate spirals it etched shapes. 3 concentric rings like ripples in ice appeared on every pane. The fire in the hearth popped in unnatural rhythm, not from damp wood, but as if echoing a pulse underground. Elias Gray, usually the calmest man in town, paced the chapel floorboards like a trapped animal. He confessed later that every time he closed his eyes, he could hear breathing. Not Annalise's, not the baby's, but a low, wet, inhaling sound, as though the house itself was learning to exhale. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it didn't sound like wind anymore. It whispered words, not in English, not in anything human. Lydia claimed she saw shadows that didn't match any of the lantern light shadows that moved before people did, but no one dared speak of it. No one wanted to say what they felt in their bones, that something ancient had followed those children out of the womb. Something that didn't like to be seen, but knew how to watch. And as the storm howled louder, so did the fear that this was only the beginning. They called them the Stillborn 3, not because they were dead, but because they never made a sound. As the weeks passed, word spread through Cedar Mills of the silent boys who watched without blinking and never shed a tear. But the real unease began when they started reacting to things that hadn't happened, yet turning their heads before a knock, staring into corners, seconds before a candle flickered. The town whispered of prophecy, of demons, of evolution. But no one knew which was worse. And when the eldest began to speak, his first words not to his mother, but to strangers, about secrets they'd never told, people stopped calling it a blessing. They started calling it a warning. Because if the children could read what you were about to do, what else could they sense? And what would happen if one day they decided to act on it? The first time one of them spoke, it wasn't to say mama. It was to tell a lie from a man's mouth before he spoke it. Caleb was the oldest by 7 minutes, and the first to break the silence. He was barely 2 years old when it happened. A local surveyor named Mr. Alden visited the Grey house to inquire about land deeds. He'd barely crossed the threshold, hat in hand, when Caleb, still cradled on Miriam, Grey's hip, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "You buried it under the maple tree." Alden froze. No one in the room understood what the boy meant until days later, when Elias followed a hunch and unearthed a rusted lockbox beneath an old sugar maple behind Alden's home. Inside were falsified documents, property stolen from free black farmers during the war. What shook everyone wasn't just that Caleb had known. It was that Alden hadn't confessed, hadn't said anything. And yet the boy heard it like a memory forming before the act. From that day on, townsfolk approached the boys like mirrors they didn't want to look into. People started locking their doors tighter, not out of fear of outsiders, but fear that the boys would already know what they were hiding, and that they'd never forget. They didn't learn language, they remembered it. By the time the triplets turned 3, It became clear they weren't learning to speak like other children. They weren't mimicking words. They weren't babbling or experimenting with sound. Instead, they waited silent, watchful, until one day they simply began speaking in full sentences. Not childish phrases, not sloppy grammar, clear, deliberate language, and not just English, Latin, German, even Gullah, a Creole tongue spoken only along the southern coast, far from Ohio. No one had ever taught them. No one in town even recognized the dialects until a Union soldier-turned-school teacher overheard Isaac whisper something under his breath. Death doesn't follow time. It remembers differently. The man turned pale and later confessed that phrase had been carved into the walls of a collapsed church he'd found near Charleston, a church used for secret burials. The town began to shift. Conversation stopped when the boys entered a room. Mirrors were covered. Clocks were turned to face the wall. Because when the children spoke, they weren't echoing the present. They were repeating something older. Something buried, something that made people ask a question no one dared answer. What if memory isn't tied to the mind, but to blood? They didn't see the world as it was. They saw the cracks beneath it. Ezra, the middle child, was the first to start drawing. He didn't scribble houses or animals like other boys. He drew structures, precise, almost architectural, though he'd never seen a blueprint in his life. Tunnels, rooms, roots, veins, entire networks of lines that seemed meaningless until Reverend Thomas, a visiting abolitionist, recognized one of the drawings. It matched the layout of a hidden safe house buried under a Lutheran church in Maryland, a location so secret even Union generals hadn't known it existed. When asked how he'd seen it, Ezra only said, "It remembers itself." The boys began to speak in a strange pattern after that, describing locations, people and sounds with a tense that blurred past and present. They would say, "She is buried there," when talking about someone who died 50 years prior. Or, "He is running," when referring to a man who hadn't escaped yet. Time to them wasn't a line, it was a bruise. One you could press in the right place and feel the ache of what had happened, or what was about to happen. And as these moments stacked word by word, drawing by drawing, the townspeople stopped asking who the boys were. They started asking what else the land might still remember, and why the boys could hear it when no one else could. At first, the town tolerated their presence like a strange storm that never passed. But by the winter of 1862, things shifted. Livestock refused to graze near the Gray property. Wells turned bitter. Children woke up screaming, swearing they saw the boys in their rooms, even when the boys hadn't left home. Something invisible had started unraveling, and soon it would no longer be silent. It wasn't just fear, it was the sense that the world had quietly changed, and no one had noticed but them. By the start of that bitter January, Cedar Mills no longer felt like home. A fog clung to the treetops for 13 days straight, unnatural, dense, unmoving. Birds stopped flying overhead. Mailmen began skipping deliveries to the Gray property even in clear weather. And then there were the fires. Small at first, a chicken coop, a tool shed. But they never spread like normal flames. They burned inward, like the heat was consuming something beneath the structure, not above it. Miriam Gray went door to door, asking for help, asking if anyone else had seen the shadows that moved against the grain of sunlight. No one answered. Some wouldn't open their doors at all. Others kept silver crosses in their windows and whispered about the watchers. Lydia's fiancé broke off their engagement overnight, claiming the boys had visited him in a dream, and whispered names he hadn't told a soul. 1 week later, he fled the county. People weren't just afraid of the boys anymore. They were afraid of what followed them. Because whatever it wasn't contained by walls. It wanted out. And soon it would get what it wanted. What do you do when the danger isn't outside your home, but growing up inside it? By the 3rd week of the cursed winter, even Miriam Gray began to falter. She'd always defended her boys, called them gifted, chosen, misunderstood. But something shifted. She started locking the cellar door from the outside at night. She shut the pockets of their coats so they couldn't bring anything home from the woods. She began whispering prayers in a language no one had taught her, tracing symbols into the frost-covered windows. The boys changed. They stopped responding to their names. They spoke to each other in murmurs too synchronized to be learned, too ancient to be invented. One night, neighbours heard pounding from the Grey house, not fists on walls, but a rhythmic beat like a war drum pulsing through the foundation. When Elias forced his way inside, he found the triplets standing in the centre of the parlour, eyes closed, mouths moving, the air around them buzzing like electricity. On the floor, they'd drawn something massive in ash and crushed berries. A circle with no beginning, no end, intersected by 3 concentric spirals. When asked what it meant, Caleb finally opened his eyes and whispered, "It's how the world listens back." From that point on, even Miriam stopped calling them her sons. She just called them the echoes. The moment you start hearing things that haven't happened yet, reality becomes a cage you can't escape from. That spring, the triplets stopped speaking entirely. But that didn't mean they stopped communicating. Instead, they began writing on walls, on bark, on their own skin. Messages that felt like riddles. At first, the past has no ceiling. She'll knock 3 times before the flood. But then the event started happening. A dam upriver burst 3 days after June found the flood carved into the underside of her porch. A neighbour was found unconscious after claiming he heard 3 knocks at his window from the inside. The boys weren't just predicting, they were documenting the future before it unfolded, as if something had already whispered the timeline into their ears. Their drawings became more detailed, almost cartographic, but the maps didn't match any land in Ohio or anywhere else. Some scholars later argued they resembled the magnetic fault lines buried beneath the Appalachian Plateau. Others thought they were nerve endings. One teacher tried to burn one of the boys' sketches. The fire wouldn't take. Their ink turned cold, then bled like a wound. By now, no one questioned whether the boys were cursed or blessed. The real question was, what were they being prepared for? And more urgently, who or what was doing the preparing? Everyone thought the worst had already come, until the triplets vanished without a trace. No footsteps, no notes, no signs of struggle. Just silence and the faint smell of copper in the air. But what came next wasn't grief. It was recognition, because something was still moving in Cedar Mills. And the town would soon realize the boys had never really left. What if the missing weren't gone? Just transformed into something we can no longer comprehend. Weeks after the triplets disappeared, strange phenomena began spreading through Cedar Mills like a virus of perception. People reported seeing 3 identical boys at the edge of their vision, never full on, always peripheral, standing perfectly still. Eyes, black skin pale like wax left in the sun. But surveillance footage showed no one. One deputy followed the shapes into the woods and returned days later, barefoot, silent, and aged by decades. Inside the grey home, black mould grew in perfect geometric spirals along the ceiling, matching the boys' last drawings. Radios picked up static that, when slowed down, revealed distorted laughter. The real horror wasn't that the triplets had vanished, but that they had shed their human form like a cocoon and left behind something that wasn't bound by physical rules, something that had learned how to overwrite the natural order. The town's collective memory began fragmenting names. Forgotten timelines bending entire conversations erased mid-sentence. No one could agree on what day it was. Because the boys hadn't just left, they had rewritten the rules of staying. They weren't just children anymore. They were the symptom of something ancient waking up beneath us. As the days blurred into each other, Cedar Mills began to fray at the edges. Birds flew in perfect triangular patterns over the grey property at midnight every night. Clocks stopped at 3:14 a.m. and refused to tick forward unless the hands were physically moved. People began sleepwalking to the old rail bridge and waking up with their mouths full of dirt and their palms etched with the same 3 spirals. A teacher opened her journal to find pages filled with writing she didn't remember composing entries signed by Isaac Ezra and Caleb. But what shattered the town's sanity was the sound. A frequency that wasn't heard but felt low humming, constant as if the earth itself was breathing from somewhere deep beneath the schoolhouse foundation. That's where the triplets had once stood during a fire drill and whispered to the soil for hours. The more the town tried to forget, the louder the frequency became, until it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence patient and watching, waiting to be acknowledged. When reality bends, it doesn't snap, it bleeds. The town's final descent began with the appearance of the table. In the abandoned community hall where the triplets once drew in chalk, a massive stone slab emerged overnight, etched with carvings no one could translate but everyone instinctively feared. It pulsed faintly like a living organ. Those who touched it fell into seizures, murmuring in perfect unison. They were never born. They were found. A local pastor tried to cleanse the space with scripture, but vomited ash mid-sermon and collapsed. Children began speaking in trios, finishing each other's sentences with eerie accuracy, even if they'd never met before. Phone lines tangled into knots overnight, forming crude silhouettes of 3 boys holding hands. People stopped using mirrors after one mother claimed she saw her reflection smiling before she did. Then came the disappearances again. But this time it was adults, rational ones, skeptics, the ones who said it was all mass hysteria. Their homes were left intact. Their clocks were frozen at 3:14. Their walls were marked by 3 words burned into the drywall: "We are memory." And from that moment forward, no one in Cedar Mills trusted the past or themselves again. What if forgetting them is exactly what lets them in? By the time federal agents arrived in Cedar Mills, the town had already become a living paradox. Streets looped into themselves. Neighbours would leave for groceries and return to find their houses duplicated side by side, one of them already occupied. Time stamps on security cameras ran backward from noon, counting toward a midnight that never came. Every file photo or document mentioning the triplets had either decayed or been overwritten by static, except for one a page from a school project titled "How to Stay Hidden in Plain Sight." Authorities dismissed it as a hoax. But then one agent began speaking in threes. Another stared too long at the spiral etched on the table and screamed for hours, begging to put them back in. A final report, leaked but never verified, claimed the town had been exposed to a non-localized consciousness anomaly, a phrase that means nothing and everything. That's when the perimeter was quietly closed. The roads were rerouted, GPS data erased. Cedar Mills was wiped from state archives. But locals say if you drive west past mile marker 41 and whisper the boys' names 3 times, your radio will cut to static and you'll hear your own voice whisper back. They were never missing. They were multiplying. When one of the old miners, Earl Matheson, was found wandering along the train tracks naked and muttering, he kept repeating a phrase that made no sense. There's 11 now. 11 with the sight. Locals thought it was the ramblings of a broken man. Until children from other towns started showing signs, drawing identical sigils, reciting historical tragedies they should never know, and answering to names they were never given. Teachers reported kids who could hear conversations before they happened. One foster home burned down after a boy claimed the others weren't real and tried to claw his own face off to reveal the copper underneath. Psychiatrists flagged dozens of cases as mass identity delusion, but those who tried to treat them, most are gone, relocated, missing. One was recorded saying, "These aren't children, they're carriers. Memory doesn't die, it migrates." The triplets, it seems, were not an end, but a beginning, a prototype. Cedar Mills was just their first memory nest. And if the pattern continues, 11 across state lines, synchronized awakenings, shared hallucinations, then what we're facing isn't paranormal, it's evolutionary. And it's already inside the bloodline. And just when Cedar Mills thought history had finally settled, another body surfaced, this time hundreds of miles away, clutching a rusted copper wire braided into a crown. The autopsy revealed no cause of death, but the coroner quit the same night, whispering, "They dream through us." What began as folklore was now rewriting biology, and it wasn't finished. They sealed the town. Not with fences or soldiers, but with silence. Cedar Mills became a ghost in the data, removed from maps, omitted from census logs, and absent from satellite imaging. But the residue remained. Travellers along old Route 41 reported nosebleeds, déjà vu loops, and waking dreams, where they spoke languages they'd never learned. A park ranger found his reflection blinking 3 seconds behind. One journalist obsessed with the triplets carved spirals into his own skin and vanished hours before his expose aired. His phone was found playing a looped voicemail, a child's voice repeating, "We're still listening." Those who've investigated the case call it a contagion of memory, not just remembering something forbidden, but being remembered by it. And the ones who try to forget, they're the ones who disappear first. This wasn't a haunting, it was a reintroduction, the kind that comes not with a scream, but with a whisper that rewrites who you were. A decade later, people still whisper the names Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, like a curse buried in syllables. Former classmates claim to see them reflected in puddles that weren't there before standing perfectly still in threes, mouths moving in reverse. One therapist who treated surviving witnesses documented 11 patients developing identical phobias. Mirrors, copper wiring, and the number 3 before her own voice began echoing with someone else's breath. In Cedar Mills, clocks in abandoned houses now sync to 3:14 a.m. no matter the power source. Families who tried to leave found their GPS routes looping endlessly, arriving back to town even after driving west for hours. It's as if the land itself, or something beneath it, refuses to release them. What began as a story of gifted children became a pattern of return, a recursive haunting written not in blood but in thought. These aren't urban legends. They're psychological footprints left behind by entities who learned to walk inside memory. The triplets didn't vanish. They multiplied inside us. Some say the Cedar Mills triplets were just a genetic anomaly. Others claim they were a precursor, the first visible sign of something ancient waking inside human evolution. But If you stand where the old school once stood, now just a skeletal ruin reclaimed by weeds and silence, you'll notice the birds don't sing. Radios lose signal. Children tug at their parents' sleeves and whisper, "They're under us." Multiple towns across the Midwest report the threes appearing in chalk on walls, scratched into lockers, etched into the backs of mirrors. And always, without exception, those marks appear on March 14th, every year, the day the triplets disappeared. Whatever they were, biological fluke, psychic mutation, or something more, they broke the timeline. Left it open humming like an old frequency we can't stop tuning into. The real horror isn't what happened, it's what's been set in motion. Because somewhere scattered across America, more children are being born with mirrored minds and empty eyes, and no one knows how many, or how long we've got. Some files were never officially sealed, but they were quietly removed, mislabeled, or simply lost. The medical examiner's report on Isaac gone. Ezra's brain scan logs from the underground lab scrubbed clean. And Caleb's final psychological evaluation, once stored in a locked vault at the Ohio Institute of Neurological Studies, was mysteriously overwritten with a single line of typewritten text. They are listening. What's more disturbing is the pattern. Researchers who've touched the triplets files either resign, vanish, or report unshakable symptoms, auditory hallucinations, time lapses, and shared dreams involving a white chapel with no doors. One doctor traced a recurring phrase found in the children's writings, sutura mentis, Latin for the seam of the mind, and proposed a theory: the triplets weren't just altered. They were born at the fault line between collective memory and individual thought. That fault line, he claimed, is expanding, and we've all been walking on it. Worse, some of us are falling in. And then there's the photograph, the one no one can explain. Found buried in the cornerstone of the old Cedar Mills church during a controlled demolition in 1993. It depicts 11 children, not 3 standing beneath the same rotting bell tower that collapsed a century ago. Their eyes are darkened by age, but someone enhanced the photo and noticed something terrifying. Every child had a faint halo of light around their heads. Except for one. That child stood apart, face blurred, body distorted, as if caught mid-motion, as if not fully part of this world. The triplets were believed to have died, but this image suggested something else. They multiplied. The phenomenon didn't end, it evolved. Some believe these children were prototypes of a new perception, vessels carrying forward a signal encoded in memory, passed not through blood, but through collective trauma. And in the right conditions, like certain frequencies or dates, March 14th, for example, they resurface. Towns whisper of children who speak in unison, draw maps of places that no longer exist, or hum that same 3-note melody no one can trace. Maybe the triplets were never meant to be understood, only remembered. Or worse, awakened. So maybe the question was never what happened to the Cedar Mills triplets, but rather what have they become? If perception can mutate, if memory itself can echo across generations, then perhaps these children weren't anomalies, but warnings. Maybe the true horror is not in what we lost, but in what we're still carrying. And if the signs are reappearing March 14th, the 11, the hum, then the past isn't done with us yet. Would you recognize them if they stood outside your door? Before you go, tell us, have you ever encountered something that shouldn't exist? Drop your story in the comments. Save this video, so you don't forget what you've learned here. And if you want more dark truths hidden beneath the surface of history, subscribe now. They're not done speaking.